Welcome to the Experian Payments Gateway demonstration webinar. This webinar provides an introduction to Experian Payments Gateway, also known as EPG, and a brief overview of the configuration. Further webinars are also available covering the processing of files using smart cards, processing of files using hardware security modules, and also the processing of bureau files. EPG is a client-server installation, and the server does all the communication with BACS and does the vast majority of the work. The client is a thick client and has to be installed on the user PCs. Each user is configured with a username. That username is case sensitive, and they have to log in with a password. The configuration of the password is configured within EPG to do with lengths, whether it needs upper and lowercase characters, etc. Okay, when we log into EPG, by default we come into the summary screen, although this can be configured such that another screen is the first screen that uses C. I'll quickly go through all of the screens, and then we'll flick into the configuration and we'll go through the configuration tabs. Summary screen shows a list of tasks, so any users that are assigned various tasks within EPG, such as responsible for import or signing or transmitting files to BACS, they'll see their tasks in this pane. Down at the bottom we'll see any alerts, so if a file fails validation or a particular task is overdue, alerts will appear down in the bottom section here. On the left hand side here we have a calendar section, so one of the ways that we can schedule tasks within EPG is to set a specific calendar event, and we'll see how that's done later. The tasks exactly the same as before, but it doesn't have the calendar pane in the top left corner there. Calendar, so as we mentioned earlier, you can set up specific events to happen at a certain time on a certain day. You would click in here, create a new event, and then associate that with a particular application within EPG. Typically that's a file type. You can then assign that to a workflow, and you can also make that a recurring task, so that every Wednesday afternoon at 3 o'clock, if you expect a file to be in a certain location, you can set EPG to go and look for that file and do something with it. And if that file is not there, EPG will alert you to the fact that that file is not there. Typically, however, most organizations use something called directory monitoring to import files into EPG, and during the little section that we have on configuration, we'll actually go through that method as well. Submissions. Once you import a file into EPG, it comes into this screen, and at any time you can open this and you can see some summary details around a file. So we've got the actual file name, when it was imported, and we've got some summary totals in here. You can browse a file at this stage. So again, we've got the header details in here, service user number, processing date. What you will notice is the totals are slightly different from the previous screen, in that EPG also includes a contra record on the file. So all BACS files are self-balancing files. So in this instance, we have 2 credits and we have a balancing debit. Hence, this debit has suddenly appeared on this screen. Any warnings or errors associated with this file will appear in the bottom section here, and if you do get a white X on a red background, if you click on it in this box, it'll take you to the offending item in here. There's also a rudimentary search function in here, so if you're looking for a specific amount or the name Smith, you can type in the value here, and next will actually take you to the next entry in the file. There is the ability to edit files within EPG, so you get back to this same screen here, but you've now got the option to go in and edit a particular field. Edit can be turned off within EPG, or it can be narrowed down to specific fields. So you can say, well, actually, we know that people may want to change the processing date, but certainly we don't want to change any of these details. And within EPG, you can be quite specific as to what fields can be changed and by whom. Okay, expected files. We mentioned calendar events previously. And the advantage of calendar events is if you're expecting a file to be present at 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon and it's not there, EPG will alert you. With directory monitoring, EPG is polling into a specific directory all the time, and once a file is presented that matches its criteria into that folder, EPG will import it, which is great because if the file is present at 2 o'clock in the morning, EPG will import it. However, if by 3 o'clock the file isn't there, there's no way that the directory monitoring can tell you that the file isn't there, and this is where expected files comes into it. So you can set expected times against the directory monitoring, such that if it hasn't imported a file by 3 o'clock on a Wednesday afternoon, EPG can be set to actually set an alert and let you know that the file has not been presented. Reports. As a result of you sending files into Bax, Bax generate a whole host of reports for you, and you can set EPG to download those reports into this screen so that you can view them within the screen. So we go in there and we can view the reports. Some reports are also generated by Bax, not necessarily as a result of you doing anything, but it could be that somebody's gone into their bank and changed some details on their bank account. So there's the AWACS and ARID reports that may come back as a result of other activity outside your control. There's an audit log, everything's audited that goes through EPG, what's been done and who's done it. Alerts, so an exploded view of alerts. Hopefully you never have enough alerts that you need them all on a separate screen. And there's also an MI console. This is an additional facility for an additional charge, where you can query the EPG backend database. So simple SQL queries, and within the documentation we give you a schema of the tables that are held on the database. Through this MI console you cannot run SQL queries to update the database, only for queries only. Also within MI you can set data harvesting. So EPG on a regular basis will harvest data from the EPG database, and it allows you to update a freestanding third-party database. That could be a SQL or Oracle database, but that is totally separate and outside EPG. If we have a look at the configuration of EPG, a whole host of tabs, and you'll be pleased to know we won't go through all these in vast detail. Communications, this is telling EPG where it's actually logging through to, and if you use a proxy setting, this is where the proxy settings are set. Signing devices, this sort of references smart card readers, but more importantly hardware security modules. This is where you'd set up the hardware security module connection within EPG if you have the HSM devices. Security, this is where you set the configuration for the usernames and accounts. So how long must they be, are they all numeric, can more than one logon be used for the same user, how often do they expire, etc, etc. Similar with password, you can set the rules behind the format of the passwords. You can also set authentication settings. So within EPG, if I walk away from my screen now, until my Windows screensaver kicks in, EPG is open and anybody can jump on and make some changes. So the way that EPG tackles this is you set re-authentication settings, and if I make a change before EPG accepts it, I've got to re-input my password. I tend not to have that set when I'm doing demos because I'm typing my password in 100 times and probably get it wrong 50 times. Originator details. So the originator detail service user number is how banks identify you as an organization, and under that you have your account details. Now a single service user number can actually accommodate up to 30 individual accounts. So you can maintain up to 30 different individual bank accounts so long as they're for the same sponsoring bank, i.e. the banks that's issued the service user number. The way that this is set up just mirrors the way that it's set up at BACS. The idea is that if you do have 30 individual accounts and you try and use one that somebody else in the organization has closed, then the banking system defaults and uses the main as a default. Behind these details, we can set limits, such if the limits are breached, by default EPG will give you an alert. And we also assign allowed applications under a service user number, just to make sure that we're not actually importing a file that wasn't actually destined for this service user number. Within the accounts, you can set up more flexible limits, and you also tell it what sort of transactions you can upload into this particular account. File formats. Data can be presented to EPG in lots and lots of different ways, and file formats allow you to map the data that is required on the file that physically gets sent to BACS with the data that's on your files. If all the data isn't on your files, we can actually set some defaults within these areas. So yeah, we haven't got any that are set to defaults on here, but a typical one is your originating account details may not be on your file, but within the file format you can actually set it to default to your sort code and account number. Therefore you don't have to populate your files with that information. Typically what we do with files, we get some sample files as early in the project as we possibly can, and we can actually test upload them into EPG and make sure that they're going to load up without any issues. An application within EPG really maps back to a file type. But it also allows you to segregate duties. So a good example would be payroll and supply payments. You may very well not be too bothered if the payroll people see the supply payment files, but you certainly may not want the supply payment people to be seeing the payroll files. So in this instance, you'd set up two distinct applications, one for payroll, one for supply payments. And then when you actually assign the roles to people, you only assign the payroll roles to the payroll people. So application roles, for a particular application, you can set up various roles with various permissions. So typically if you've got people that are dealing with the files, then you give them permissions to do things with files, but you don't give them permissions to do anything with the sort of config and administration side of things. Conversely, if you've got somebody who's administering the system, you give them certain rights to be able to do their administrative role, but you wouldn't give them anything to do with files, so they can't actually process files. So their application roles, what can people do with an application, a file? Global roles essentially paint what buttons and tabs people can see. So global roles work in conjunction with application roles. You could give a user all the application roles in the world, but if you give them no global roles, they can't see any buttons to be able to do anything. So they work in conjunction with each other. Once the application roles and global roles are set up, you then allocate those to individual users. So for instance, we've got a signer user here. They get the standard global role, so a standard set of buttons that they can see. And then within the actual applications, we're not allowing them to do anything with payroll or manual import or that one, but within this particular directory monitoring application, we're allowing them to sign, and also with that one. If we look at the transmitter, then they've got a different role. For a user, you can build up these roles as well. So if we did want the same person to be able to sign and transmit, then we'd be able to click on both and build up the permissions that they have. FTP is there if you want to FTP some files out to a location, typically a Unix server. Merge queues, these come into play if you are a bureau and you want to build bureau files. Workflows, this is how you tell EPG how it's going to process a file. So here's a sample here where we are going to import a file. We're going to pop it down for manual authorize, we're going to sign it, and we're going to transmit it. So that's a typical thing that might happen with a file. There are 4 things that must happen to a file before it goes to BACS. One is you must import it into EPG. As part of the import, EPG will automatically validate that file. You must sign it using either a credential on the smart card or a credential on a hardware security module, and the act of signing a file uses those credentials to encrypt the file and encapsulate it. So once signed, that file cannot be changed in any way, shape or form. Once you've actually got a signed file, there's only 2 logical things to do with it. One is to transmit it to BACS, which is a 4th point in the process. Or if somebody comes running saying, no, that file's no good, don't send it, then you should delete it. If you don't delete it, it will stay in EPG forever and a day. Validation rules, there's a whole host of validation rules that are set by BACS behind the scenes, and also some additional validation rules set within EPG. You can upgrade warnings and information to an error, and an error would then prevent the file going to BACS. However, you cannot downgrade any hard, fast BACS errors to warnings. These validation rules are set by application, so you can have a different set of rule settings for your payroll as opposed to your supplier payments or direct debit collection. Reports. Once reports are downloaded into EPG, you can set off a set of rules that could email out a report or drop it down into a folder. If dropped down into a folder, it could then be used to suck back up into your back-end systems to sort of complete the loop of the direct debit processing, for example. So if we look at this here, we've got a rule set up that says for this type of report, for all that reports are a couple of report types in there. For this service user number, save it to a file in XML format, and this is a folder it's going to save it to. However, what you could do is say, well, actually we want to send that as an email, and then this bit here would be an email address. You could also decide to send it in HTML. You can set up as many rules as you wish for each type of report service user number. Should you want to reformat the data rather than just having it there as XML, you can set up custom formats. So we've got one here for an ARID report, and this is saying, right, we're going to call it hopefully something meaningful. For this report group, for this report type, we're going to create the file with this output, and we're pointing to an XSLT style sheet here. And what the style sheet does is it reads the XML from the download report, and it reformats into a flat file. Some organizations would prefer to receive flat files into their back-end systems rather than XML. Now those rules run once the reports are actually downloaded into EPG. So the process is you log on to the payment services site, it downloads reports, and then it plays the rules. Archiving, we'd recommend that archiving was run on a regular basis, daily, once a week maybe, and you set a number of days to keep audit logs, reports and submissions. Now, I've seen this set to 1 day, I've seen it not set. Typically, organisations are looking to keep between 3 and 6 months worth of data on the system. Typically, if you haven't had a query after 3 months, then you're unlikely to receive a query. The archive does get written away into a folder structure, so you can retrieve it once it's been archived. However, you can't review it or view it in EPG once archived. Okay, so earlier we mentioned workflows, so defining what happens to a file, and we've also mentioned directory monitoring. Now, what directory monitoring does is, for the application you're setting up the directory monitoring for, you tell it to run a particular workflow, you point it into a folder, you give it a file name to look for, and you can use wildcard characters in here. You tell it a file format to use to convert the data when it's importing, and you tell it what to do with the file once it's imported. You can't leave it there because it's directory monitoring, so you've either got to move it to another location or you can delete it. Disaster recovery. Within EPG, you can configure a database backup to recur on a regular basis, and that writes a copy of the database, typically to a remote server, and also you can set it to write a log of events. So the idea is that if the server does fail, you can bring up your disaster recovery server, restore the database, and then replay the log to get up to as near the failure time as possible. When it's actually doing the backup, you can set it to run a grandfather father son backup, in which case this would be your latest, this would be the penultimate, and this would be whatever the word is for the one before the penultimate. If you don't set this, then all three of these would be an exact copy of the last backup taken. Earlier we mentioned the MI console and how you can harvest data from within EPG. This is how you set up the actual harvesting and updating of the third-party database. Okay, that concludes this part of the webinar. As I said at the beginning, there are other webinars available that will walk you through processing files using smart cards or hardware security modules, and there's another one that will walk you through bureau processing. I hope you found that useful. Thanks for listening, and I hope to see you one day when I come and actually install your system. Thank you.